Today we are with Kristen Habacht. She's the head of EDR team at Atlassian. Her expertise is mostly in sales, coming from Trello. And welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so for this specific session, I'd like to focus specifically on sales and mostly your experience from Trello scaling, acquisition, and then moving on and maybe different challenges as well in Atlassian at the moment. How does that sound?
That sounds great to me.
All right, cool. So one of the things that I'd like to maybe kick things off with is Trello being a freemium type of model. When you joined Trello, what were some of the challenges you haven't anticipated?
So when I joined Trello, they didn't have any sales team at all. So the first challenge that we had to figure out was how we were going to sell Trello to people who weren't just willing to put a credit card down and buy it. And so we focused at the time primarily on the enterprise sale, but we had to build, the entire model out from scratch. The challenges we had to face, especially with it being freemium, is understanding who had the authority to buy, potentially hundreds of free users within a company, roll that up as a contract level, and what they cared about that would take them from being happy on a free version or potentially unaware that so many people were on the free version to paying an enterprise price, which is a premium price on a product that, again, they had been using happily for no price at all.
That's right.
So it was a combination of, what those pain points were, what the personas were that we should be pursuing, and what that process was going to look like from beginning to end. So we had guesses around what our sales cycle would be, what that process would look like. But until we got into it, we really didn't, we didn't know where it would land.
Yeah, it sounds like a massive undertaking.
Yeah, it's truly starting something from scratch. We had the benefit of the product having already proven to some extent some product market fit, right? A couple million people at the time when I joined were already using it. But it really was very much still a, word of mouth, like I'm using it to do this hodgepodge of things. And it hadn't really been messaged as a business tool necessarily. So, we pretty much built that entire enterprise side of the house, that entire business side of the house from scratch when I started. So we took it in pieces, right? We went with those lowest hanging fruits, those people that were already raising their hands, asking questions about things like security. So I had come from a managed security services background. So I knew that if people were asking about security, that was usually the easiest way to begin a monetization process, because what are people concerned about? They're concerned about their data getting out. So our initial play was really, instead of trying to boil the ocean, we said, let's just go with a security play to start out with. And we expanded over time past that, but it was such a massive undertaking that we had to have, really confined guardrails, because we couldn't just go after, I think it was like 5 million users, maybe less than that at the time that I joined, but still a huge number of people to say, well, let's just try and see what they want to buy. So we really did go from a security play, and that helped us narrow down then, industries that would be concerned about security. And then we would look at how many users they had on the freemium model. And eventually that kind of helped us target down like a high level kind of hit list of what we would have called like high value accounts to go after.
Yeah, your VIPs type of people.
Right.
Yeah. Did you actually, were you surprised by the going up market so quickly? Because you went from a freemium, one of the road possible would have been to simply say, all right, time's over, guys. We're going to, charge you $5 a month, whatever. And so what actually drive the decisions to, at that point where you have such a huge user base, what drives the decision to actually say, okay, we're going to go enterprise with all that it means, like maybe longer sales cycle, maybe 6 months, 8 months. Maybe that's something also we can explore into the sales cycle. Have you been taken by surprise or those things?
Yeah. So we kind of said, well, who's going to be the most likely to pay? And that was a security angle. And then it also was a user size angle. And so, we started with 100 users. If you had 100 users, and the reason 100 is kind of a nice sweet spot is that it's big enough that you're probably concerned that 100 people at your company have a free tool that they're putting data into, but it's not so big that you have to try and go get $1 million approved, which is, that's going to be, if you're kind of own startup and all of a sudden it's coming across the desk of, a CIO or something to pay a massive amount. So we called it enterprise, but we did start very much with what I would call like kind of mid-market accounts, and that let us test out that messaging. And so our sales cycle was pretty tight actually at that time. It was about 90 days, which I was surprised by because there was no compelling event. So that thing you mentioned about, hey, time's up, you got to pay. We didn't have that. So I really did expect much longer sales cycles. But I think because maybe we had such a targeted message and we could really pinpoint the folks that it would resonate with. So we did start with mid-market, even though we called it an enterprise product. And it's important too to recognize that 100 users might have been at an enterprise account, right? It might have been at like a Johnson and Johnson or a Yahoo or something that's very large, but we were just going with a real kind of land and expand model at that time. And again, we didn't want to be such a large dollar item that it raised a lot of questions, at least initially. So that was where we started. And then we very quickly scaled up an account management team that would take it that second half of the way, right? Which is get an MSA in place and then let your land team move on and try to pick up more accounts like that. And we did have a substantially sized, well, for us, we had kind of the same amount of account executives that we had as account managers. And those account managers went back into those accounts and tried to take that user count from 100 to 1,000 then. And that's where that expansion of that enterprise play started.
Yeah, that's pretty smart. That means you were trying to minimize the number of people involved in making the deal because of the size.
Yep.
Did you find that because most of the SaaS businesses actually go from presenting you the very expensive plan first in order to psychologically, prep
right.
the customer into saying like, actually, this plan's not that expensive.
Yeah.
But with Trello, you actually start with a freemium model. Did you think that actually hurt your deal size initially?
Yeah, I think whenever you do freemium, you make this trade-off, right? You make a couple of trade-offs. One trade-off you make is that you're going to have a large percentage of your customer base that's probably not paying. And that's okay, because hopefully you get enough people who convert out of that to pay for all of those people. Yep. And folks like Slack and stuff, prove that that's a way to do it. But then the trade-off is your biggest competitor is yourself, right? You're going against yourself. You're going after this free version of yourself. And so what ends up happening, I think a lot of times, is that you do very much end up with smaller initial contract sizes because you're like, let's just get you on one team paying. Let's get you on some subset of these people paying. And what we found is that the product is really well designed and people loved the product. And so as much as a salesperson, I'd love to take all the credit for it. The product then really did drive that additional adoption. And people inside those groups would say, oh, you have XYZ features. Why don't we have that? Because they'd be working with those people inside different, boards and things like that. And so, then we would really let it expand. So yeah, those initial deals were smaller, but we very quickly would see increases off of that. 30 days, 60 days, we would see pretty substantial increases off of those contract sizes. And I think it was a very customer friendly way of doing it, which is, hey, you don't have to buy everybody that's on this free version. We recognize this might not be right for all of those people. Pick the group that is the right for you and let's start it. But we almost always ended up getting all those users onto the paid version during the span of that contract.
Yeah, because Trello is more of a true freemium. There's a lot of SaaS fake freemium.
Right.
Like you can use it for free, but the variable in which you can operate are so small that you're gonna have to pay anyway if you really want to use it. But with Trello, you can actually just use it, for free.
Yeah, especially back at the beginning, there really weren't a lot of paid features, and so it was pretty much like, I could use this forever. And, will I hit a board limit? No. Will I hit a team limit? No. Will I hit a user limit? No. So there was those things that when you look at a traditional freemium, eventually it's like, you're out of storage, you're out of user, you're out of whatever.
That's right.
We didn't have any of those trigger points. So that's why, like I said, you had to make these really smart plays about who you went after. And you just had to, I think for us, we had to accept that. And I remember having these conversations with Michael right when we were starting, which is, you're right, that account might have 1,000 users. Let's just get 100, let's get 200, whatever it was. Let's get a yes. And then you can go after those other groups and say, oh, did you know there's already an MSA in place? Like, we've taken care of the legal and the security. Your team's already said it's okay. And then we would pick up all those additional little yeses along the way until we had the whole company. And then, later, a year or two later, when more features had been in place and there was enough logo counts where we could say to people, hey, look, this company's using us, this company's using us, this company's using us. We then started to be able to sell more top down. We could go to a CIO, we could go to somebody on the C-suite and say, did you know you had 7,000 users in Trello? And then those conversations were at a high level. But there was always a mix of accounts that were at that land and expand, and then at that top down. And we had a kind of a healthy diversity of those two things.
So again, there was a choice between, the land and expand. I mean, there were not so many notification that you have to pay, or there is even a possibility of paying and going business.
Right.
So you probably had to drive most of the awareness in outbound style, like you mentioned, just going and reaching out to people.
Right.
Was that a conscious choice to do that, or instead of letting everyone know at some point?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of the scrappiness of a startup, which is we had to think about what resources we were going to put where. And,
right.
I think in an ideal world, would I have loved that in the interface, it would have popped up and said, hey, you're part of a group that has 1,000 users. You should look at XYZ. I mean, sure, I would have loved that. But we were running at the time, especially when we started, I think there were like 2 people in marketing. There was 3 people maybe in sales. And so it did just kind of become a thing where we could do outbound faster than marketing and product could make an interface to educate people about it. That obviously expanded as we grew, and that did change, and we did get more demand gen folks on who could help us. But in the early days, it was just kind of a resource constraint decision that helped us get there. And I think it at the end, I think it really worked out because it allowed us to inform a lot of what marketing's ultimate moves were, because we had tested it out from an outbound perspective with our reps so much that we could say, hey, these kind of accounts look really good. Hey, these don't. You might have a lot of users, but if it's an EDU, it's probably not a great target account. Let's not waste a lot of email and webinar effort or wherever else onto that. So it worked out in the end, but yeah, it was not, I wouldn't say it was as much a conscious choice as it was kind of a resource constraint.
Got it. So if you had to give some advice to someone who has a freemium model and try to look into monetization, what would be some of your top 3 picks of advice that you will give them?
Yeah, so there's probably a few. One is that I feel like, and I've said this in other conversations before, and I feel really strongly about this. If I had to go back in time and change out some of my resources, very early on, I would have hired a sales ops person to help us understand that slicing and dicing of those accounts and how to be more targeted. And, we were doing a lot of it very slowly, very manually. Reps were doing it. It was inconsistent. And I think a good analyst on that data could have helped us, speed that up a lot. I think the other thing I would have said, so Trello was unique, and I think this will be dependent on what people are doing. We were kind of consumer and business focused. So our initial marketing reps, a lot of them were more on the consumer side, trying to get that drum of users signed up. And in reality, if you're signing up consumers, they work usually too. So it did flow between those two. I think I wish, and I would advise people to look to make sure they're getting a demand gen from the business side as well, if they do have that split, which is you don't want to take the foot off the gas on consumer if you're trying to do that multiplay, but you want to make sure you're getting business messaging done at the same time. So those are 2 of the biggest changes that I would have done. I think with sales ops, if your audience is mostly sales in the conversation, I think sales ops on the analyst side would have been the number 1 thing I would have changed.
Yeah, Trello has a very broad appeal as well. So how many personas did you end up with, roughly?
We had probably maybe 4 or 5 that were,
okay.
Yeah, we narrowed it down pretty tight because at the end of the day, it really did still really remain a security play. And that's kind of where the best conversion rates ended up being at. So there were a few different ones, but from a marketing standpoint, we had a few different personas, right? We had like, a chief marketing officer and PMMs and a few other things like that. But from a sales side, we did keep that personas fairly tight because we learned who was going to pay and who wasn't, where budget came from and where it didn't. And we did keep it hyper focused because again, it's too much otherwise. And just to reiterate too, Atlassian and Trello were very similar in the sense that salespeople only touch that very top tier of accounts, maybe the couple percentage point level accounts, and that there's this massive underneath of the pyramid that we're having self-serve, and those people are converting on their own and they're buying on their own. So there's a lot of personas in there that are buying and converting. They just aren't the tier that we're putting sales resources towards. Those are just buying on their own. They're going through marketing. They might go through a channel partner, whatever it is. And only that top tier is being handled by a salesperson.
Yeah, understood. And that means from the sales perspective, you were working with existing leads most of the time. You didn't actually did, cold outreach to figure out like, hey, would you want to use Trello? Or even, if it was like a massive enterprise.
Yeah, that was a core tenet from the very beginning. And I do think that's one of the huge benefits of freemium, which is that landing is being done for you. Like let that happen for you, let that growth happen for you. And then you come by and start to just kind of pull it up, collect it up. So yeah, we didn't do any outbound in the sense of, hey, you look like someone who might use Trello. Have you looked at it? Should you, play with it, whatever.
Here's a cold email for you.
Yeah, we didn't do any of that. You had to have an existing Trello footprint. It had to be big enough. You had to have been active in it for a period of time. And those are really the ones we went after. And Atlassian is the same way, right? Like we don't call anybody and try to explain, hey, you should be using Jira and you're not. So again, when the acquisition did happen, that was one of the things that merged us nicely, really nicely together, which is those sales philosophies were the same. And the way we thought about how to service the customers was the same in that sense.
Okay, so take me through. Sorry, on a personal note, I always thought that freemium was actually a marketing price. So it's like it's a marketing department in a sense. You're actually paying for getting that marketing.
Yeah, and that's how we always talked about it. And that's why, like I said, we were resource constrained because we did kind of say the AWS cost to run Trello the marketing budget, right? And then, there was a sales budget. So we were really lean on that marketing side because all that what you would have spent on Google AdWords and demand gen and all, we were just spending on the hosting and providing the service for free.
What are some of you mentioned sales philosophy. What are some of the massive differences between, Trello, Atlassian, and other type of SaaS businesses?
Yeah. So very early on at Trello, when we were building out the team, I had sat down with Michael, who is the founder and the CEO, and he and I had worked together before, and I knew it was really important for him that salespeople were value add in the conversation, that they weren't aggressive, that no one should leave having a bad taste having interacted with one of our salespeople. And that, because we were competing against ourselves, losing deals were fine as long as they stayed with Trello, right? If we lost to ourselves, that was okay. And so what that meant was we would never sell anything that wasn't developed already, for example. So a lot of times, if you have kind of what I would call as like a not as refined sales system, what you might have somebody say is, if you sign the contract, we'll get that feature in for you, right? And it's hard, right? Especially in those early days, because people will say, I will give you, and it feels like a lot of money, whatever the number is, if you guys just add, whatever, colored cards, whatever silly thing it is, or maybe it's an important thing like single sign-on. And I would go back and say, do you realize how much money we're losing if all we have to do is implement this thing? And sometimes I won and sometimes I lost. But the expectation with the customer always was, this is the product as it is, and we're working on things, but I can't promise you anything. So don't buy this expecting that gets you something developed. And I think customers appreciated that, but a lot of folks aren't used to that, right? And the other thing is that, we really tried to be as honest about our pricing and our terms and all that stuff as possible, which means we tried not to get into negotiations a lot. We tried not to have inflated conversations around like, I'm going to put this price at 300 because I know by the time everything is said and done, we'll actually end up at 175. And that's the price I wanted us to get to anyway. So we really tried to make sure our pricing was fair, and we tried not to get into those negotiations. Now, the difference between all of that, I think, is core to how Atlassian thinks about sales as well. The difference is that Atlassian doesn't get into any negotiations at all. So there's no pricing negotiations. There's no term negotiations. And we were small at the time, and there was no way for us to say like, we won't look at your contract. We just didn't have the gravitas of a large enough company to get away with that. But when we did get acquired, we were kind of able to say like, hey, this is Atlassian's contract. You either take it or you don't. So I think the philosophies were really, really, really similar. I think the difference was the leverage you have as a small company doing it, and then the leverage you have as a like large public company doing it. It allowed us to do more once we joined them along the philosophy we wanted to build out, because we could say things like that. And you know, in a startup, we were just a little bit more, we needed that money. That was going to keep us from going and doing fundraising and stuff. So if someone really wanted to mark up a non-disclosure, we were going to let them do it. We weren't going to stop as long as it was a reasonable sized contract.
Oh, yeah, I run into this as well with my own SaaS, and basically I just quote other user with way more seats that don't have any discount, and then people think, okay, then that's fair, and then they go at it. So you've been ramping up the team, the sales team, from barely yourself to a lot of people. There must have been a lot of learning into the hiring process. At what time did you decide to hire a new salesperson?
Yeah.
What did you look for during the interview? I know on some of the occasion you should have followed your gut from the things I heard. But what are some of the key learnings here? What would you actually recommend someone to look for when they're doing the interviews, and when to call?
Yeah, I think, interviewing and staffing is one of the biggest challenges I think probably any startup, especially, but any company really has. And I've talked to a lot of founders who have asked me like, how do you know what kind of VP of sales to bring in? How do you know what kind of reps to bring in initially? Because it is really hard, and you do kind of live or die by the success of those people, especially in the early days. So a few things I learned. One is that we always had a diversity of candidates or diversity of employees at Trello interviewing, so that we got different perspectives from different people. So especially in the early days, we'd have someone from engineering, someone from product, somebody from marketing, somebody from sales. And especially because we were talking to so many IT people, it was really important for me to know what our VP of engineering's take on a salesperson was, right? Like, is this somebody you would be comfortable talking to? How did that conversation go? With our VP of product, we were partnering with product to make these decisions. Like, so is this a person you want to be interacting with? Is the communication there? And then we would have them do a pitch, and they would have a role play sales conversation with us based off of Trello. And I would look for those kind of fundamental sales skills, right? Did you ask good questions? Were you listening? Did you have empathy in the conversation? Did you establish a good rapport? All those core fundamental things you expect them to do. The other thing that I liked to do, and I found the most successful, especially with a startup, now maybe with a more established company, it's slightly different than this, but I liked to have people that were not from particularly well-established like sales methodology places. So I had some people from Salesforce that ended up great, but I tried to avoid kind of the big shops. And the reason why is that I found that people who came in with that background, especially if they've been doing it for a long period of time, they had gotten so used to having these large infrastructures that supported them. Oh, I had an enablement team training me every time there was a new release. I had sales ops doing this. I had an SE. So I never actually did any of the technical conversation. They were just so, I don't want to get in trouble with anybody, but they were modeled in the sense like you had already been at something that had been so figured out. Yeah. And we were still so the opposite of that. So I actually looked for people who had been in kind of brutal industries. So advertising, I had people who did like radio sales. One of my top sales reps, she was from doing like real estate ads, like selling to developers for sites like Tria and stuff. Just places where you got told no more times than you ever possibly could have been told yes. Just kind of brutal processes. Because when they came over to Trello, people were so fond of the brand, and it was such a refreshing change. I remember people just saying to me, like, it's so weird people call me back if you talk to me when I call them. So they had kind of been used to abuse and having to do things a lot on their own that it didn't feel like that here. Like, it felt like, sure, maybe everything wasn't buttoned up, but who has everything buttoned up? So they were game to play that entrepreneurial, like, let's build a thing out together. And then the other thing I would definitely say is have a diversity of salespeople, right? Have people who come from different backgrounds, who have different whatever it is. But our team was always a real mix, whether it was gender, ethnicity, education, previous background. And I think that was one of the reasons we work so well, is that sometimes I've seen people tend to hire teams that look and think most importantly, probably just like them. And you get into this echo chamber. And I think one of the things we did really right at Trello was that our team was not like that. We had some, and maybe you butt heads sometimes, so that meant there were people who were willing to challenge. I think that was really great for us.
So when was the time to grow? When did you think, okay, I need to hire someone now?
So I knew right when I started that we would want to hire 2 enterprise or 2 account executives right away. One, because I know what I can do, so I would base level it, but then I wanted to see what additional reps that were 100% focused on it would do. I think a lot of people say this, right? You never wanted to hire one because then you don't know, is it that person? Is it the messaging? So we wanted 2.
It's very common, actually, advice. Have you known anyone who actually tried with just one?
I do. I know people who've tried with just one, and it is, they almost always had a second person.
Fair enough.
It's a lot of headbutting, and it's a lot of like kind of slamming your head against the wall in the meantime. You just don't know. Either you're like, this is great, or is it? It's just, there's always a question of if things are working.
That's right.
So yeah, 2 people, I think, I'm not, inventing anything new here with that, but we wanted to have 2. So we had 2 people come on right away. And then the question was, when do you start adding? And so I think the first person we added outside of that was an account manager, because we did kind of recognize that model of land and expand. And we hired 2 of those pretty quickly as well. Then I would say that, it was a little bit not as scientific as it probably should have been. And this probably goes back to having like maybe somebody from an analyst side who could have said, okay, look, here's your available market, here's whatever. But I was just kind of going off of lead volume, right? I knew how much somebody could handle because I baselined it long enough with these folks and myself doing the work. I knew what our sales cycles were. I knew what kind of inbound volume we were getting. So I was trying to keep that ratio there. And then we started layering outbound onto that pretty quickly. And there's some industry standards generally around, you can hold about 50 accounts, in that mix. And then the question really, I think, becomes, do you keep hiring more people and have them doing all the motions, or do you specialize, right? Do you have an SDR or BDR team who can take that front end of the cycle? That allows you to have a lot more lower cost resources, and you don't have to hire as many account executives. So we did ultimately kind of go that path. After I think we had about 10 account executives around that, and we did that. But yeah, I would just say we had baselined it. We knew what people could work. We knew what those conversion rates were. And when that volume started to slip, because we could see, okay, we're getting a lot of leads in and things are converting lower, we would hire somebody in.
Did you had any pushback from hiring? Did you have to fight for getting like a new salesperson?
No, I was the opposite, actually. At the time, I think Michael was kind of saying, well, how many do you need? Why don't you just have 10? And I was like, well, I don't know what to do with 10. And I think that is part of the philosophy of how I grew the team and how he thought about growing the team versus how I think some startups grow, which is, for good or ill, like, I think it worked out well for us. It's probably unique to every situation. We wanted to be a fairly profitable sales team. We didn't want to just throw a ton of heads at it, figure it out, and really run out of our runway faster and have to go do another fundraising round sooner. So with that conversation with him, I was like, I'll take the heads, but let's make sure they're smart heads. Like, I want to make sure I have enough for them to do. And so we kind of found compromise in that. I didn't want to just throw a bunch of resources at it. And maybe, maybe if we had done another fundraising round, we had raised, I think, 10 million at the time. Maybe if we did another fundraising round, it had been a much larger chunk, we would have then said, like, let's go sales bananas. Like, let's just throw a ton of resources at this thing. And we had talked about what that would look like. And we were going to scale our SDR team pretty substantially to accommodate for that, which I think is kind of a traditional move. But we were trying to be really thoughtful with that money that we had in the bank, and we were a profitable sales team, through that, which is not something a lot of startups can say. So I think it worked out well. I think it helped us in the acquisition side of the house as well, but that's where it was through that round. But I never really had pushback from him on that.
Yeah, talking about money, I know it's a difficult subject for a lot of startups. Is what are actually not startups for a lot of sales teams. Can we talk about sales compensation?
Sure.
How was that established? What are some of the key learnings and mistakes, and maybe some advice for people listening?
Yeah. So Trello in general had a philosophy which is fairly unique, which was that the baseline role for any role had a base pay, right? So if you were an account executive, you were going to be paid X. If you had past employment history that said you've been paid at Y, like, you're going to have to make a decision. Do you want to join the Trello and potentially it's a pay cut for you, but there's equity, there's all these other things. And for some people it was a raise, right? And there's a bunch of there's a bunch of research that basically supports the fact that historical pay being used in conversations basically hurts minorities and women and a bunch of other things where we have lower historical pay numbers. So then we move into a new job where we get paid off of our historical pay. So part of it was an equity thing, which was everyone, if you choose to do this job, everyone's the same. So if I'm sitting next to Jim and I'm sitting next to Robin, we all know we have the same pay structure. And as a salesperson, we'll have the same commission plan too. And what that meant was that you can overachieve, you can underachieve, but that's all on you. Like, that if you make more than somebody else or you make less, that's directly because of your efforts. But from a base perspective and from equity perspective, all those things, it was the same. So to some extent that made recruiting really interesting, because it was kind of like, that's the number, I'm not going to negotiate with you. Either you believe in joining it or you don't. And I really think we almost never had anyone turn us down, maybe like 2 people in the long run. It was pretty small percentage points. So from a comp perspective, it was 50-50, right? 50% of their OTE was base, 50% was commission. They could overachieve. There was no cap on that, but there were also no multipliers, which is kind of a controversial concept, because normally what you would say is, well, once you hit X, then your comp goes to 2X or 3X, whatever it was.
That's right.
And what we always said to our reps was, for the most part, what that is they're kind of undercomping you in the first half, and then you're expected to blow it out to be able to really get where they're actually on the books, kind of thinking about what they'll be paying you. And then some people achieve past that. That's totally true. For us, we were going with, again, from an effort from transparency, we're going to pay you what the OT is that we think is right. And if you go in industry around, like in New York at the time, or we have remote people too, you'll see that's generally what you need. We're just going to give you a straightforward path. You'll never have to have like an advanced calculus degree to understand what your commission payment is going to be. It's, blank. And it's the same for everybody. And I think there was a beauty to that simplicity of the plan, and the fact that we very rarely had comp problems with people. We very rarely had arguments around commission plans. That commission plan stayed the same for the most part through the entire time until we got acquired. Targets changed against it as the company grew, as pricing changed, things like that, but the structure stayed the same. And I think, I look back on that and I think about the other places I've worked and other sales teams I've run, and the amount of time I spent talking and thinking and dealing with comp was infinitesimal compared to like other places where I've had to deal with it. So I think it eliminated a lot of that.
Yeah, I totally love that. So let's dig a little bit deeper on this.
Yep.
Do you differentiation between closing deals on a yearly rate, on a monthly rate, or was it, it's only yearly, there's no monthly anywhere for when it comes to enterprise? What type of model was that for renewable?
So on enterprise, we only sold annual. So that helped resolve that, right? Which, there's some other, we did eventually have a team that was doing some more like SMB assistance, and they had monthly, and we had a rate for monthly that basically worked out to what you would have gotten paid on an annual. So we tried to make it the same because, monthly is in a lot of ways better than annual because you pay a premium for it. Because normally your monthly prices, there's a discount for annual. And we knew we didn't see a lot of churn. So for us, monthly was almost always more profitable than annual. But annual would get the money up front. So there's a comfort to that. So we just kind of said to the reps, like, hey, if the rate is 10% here or whatever, 12%, then we're going to give you just the entire month payment for monthly. So it's the same. We don't care. But from the enterprise side, they couldn't sell monthly. So it was just annual. And they got a percentage of the annual sale. And if they sold a multi-year, as long as that multi-year was prepaid, they got a percentage of the entire prepayment. If it was not prepaid, they only got the percentage of the first year. And we didn't sell a ton of multi-year, but it was a nice way, if someone was trying to get some budgeting done because you got a discount with a 3-year, they could push it, and then the rep got a little bit of an extra bonus because they collected all 3 years up front. But it was pretty just like a flat rate. And then if you were on our account management team, you had a percentage that you had to have of renewals. So, your base for that month had to renew at X%. And if it renewed at X%, you got a flat just bonus. It wasn't based off of the percentage. And then you got a percentage of any expansion sales you were doing. So again, like someone might have held a bigger book of business from a renewal side, but they were getting the same flat, like $500, whatever it was at the time for renewal. But a renewal motion, it can be hard, and I don't want to take away from what account managers do, but it's not as hard. It doesn't change necessarily. The renewal doesn't change as much if the contract is 100,000 or 300,000, right? Like you're generally still kind of dealing with the same problems. And really the expansion is where you would still be making the bulk of your money on that. So we wanted to keep that balance where you got something for doing your renewals, but you remembered that your job was the expand job, and we wanted to make sure that got taken care of first.
That makes sense. Is there some of the thing, so that simplicity added a lot of simplicity, funnily enough. Is there some places where you think it added friction?
I think in the recruiting process, there were people who it was just such a very foreign concept of like, I'm a alpha salesperson and I want to know that if I close, then I'm going to crush it more than everybody else around me. And I think, and this is similar to Atlassian, I think the stance we took as Trello, and I think Atlassian's is really similar, which is you honestly might not be very happy with the way we run our sales team if that's like a huge friction point for you right now. And so we kind of looked at it as like, if it filtered out people who wouldn't have been happy anyway working with us. Not that they wouldn't have been successful, but they just probably wouldn't have been happy. And so again, I think most of that friction would have happened on the recruiting side. But by the time someone made that choice and joined us, it really wasn't that difficult. And I think, again, we didn't lose many candidates through it. It just maybe you took a little bit more conversation up front to have them understand why and what we were doing and how it was going to work out. But I mean, the little bit of friction there, I would not have traded for the amount of simplicity it got us on the back end. So, but that would be the point, I would say, that where it gave us some friction.
So you kind of use that as a cultural fit test as well, to some extent.
Yeah, a little bit, right? Which is, hey, we're not going to be a super aggressive team, and you are selling against yourself, and so people need to have an amazing experience when they interact with you, and you can't just like cold call up 100 accounts and say whatever, and be okay with burning 90 of those because you'll get 10. And not that that's necessarily what those people always do, but it just was kind of indicative of like how you were going to be as a team player and all these other things. And people did really well on the team, and they blew out their numbers and they overachieved and they made, good money. They just made it in a way that was a little bit more flat. Like everybody had the same opportunity to do that. Everybody had the same visibility to do it. So, it was a little cultural fit challenge. Yeah. But I think it helped us in the long run.
Can you clarify for me how this sales compensation actually helped having people not burning leads?
Yeah, I think it kind of came back to we're comping you fairly off of the accounts that we see and what that account group is, which means that you don't have to go. I think especially with some like overachievement, it's like you're not going to have this huge reward if you go outside of what we said and you hustle really hard onto it and then you blow it out. Like we're going to have you succeed with the group that we've set you aside with, and to treat them well, nurture that group and handle it the way it should be handled. And if you get a contract for bigger than we expected or for multi-years and you prepay it, that's great. And you will see benefit off of that, but you don't need to go and do additional hunting past what we've told you to hunt, basically.
Yeah, there is this philosophy of having hunter versus farmer, and so
Right.
your salespeople were more on the farmer side.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, exactly. It was a little bit more on the farmer side. And what I would say is maybe it was like, trying to think of what a good metaphor too would be. I mean, they had to hunt, they had to go into those accounts. Let's call it like sustainable hunting, right? They couldn't wipe out the population. They couldn't kill all the dodos because then there'd be no dodos left. But they still needed to go and do it, and they needed to do it in a smart way. So yeah, it's like getting a hunter's license if you're in the States, right? You can go, you can get X amount of deer during the season. You can't just go take out the whole forest though, because then there's no deers left. So that's, I would say it's like that balance of hunting and farming, because I don't want to make it seem like, they didn't function like a salesperson,
Sure.
that they functioned more like an account manager, because they did have to do a lot of hard sales motions, but they had to do it in a way that wouldn't kill the food supply.
I love that. I'm gonna switch the perception a little bit, and I'm gonna say, what do you think would have been a catastrophe to apply in while you were in that sales department? Rather than what actually made you a success, what actually didn't make you a failure.
Okay, so what would have been a bad thing for us to do?
Bad decision, yeah, definitely to do, and you're happy you haven't taken it.
I think there was conversation in the early days of if we should hire a team that would call accounts that didn't have a Trello footprint and try and get it in. And I don't know if it would have been a catastrophe in the sense that it would have affected the rest of the team, but I think it would have been a catastrophe for the people who we asked to do that, because I still really feel like that would have been an entirely wrong motion for us. And I think it was one of those things where we were like, well, this is a traditional sales model. This is how you sell enterprise. So why don't you have a team doing that? And I probably answered that question several times from different folks in the company and through other meetings that we had. And I think if I'd taken a bite on that, I think it would have been a huge mistake. I think a lot of people would have been set up for failure. We would have had some really unhappy salespeople, which would have brought down the entire team. And I think it just would have been a slog for no decent return. So I think that would be the one thing I can think of off the top of my head, at least, that probably would have been a real catastrophe if we had done it.
You have a lot of remote salespeople.
Yeah.
How does that work?
So remote employees is one of my passion projects. I think not enough people embrace it. I think that it depends, I'm sure, on your team and things like that. But for me, speaking of catastrophe, I think it also would have been a catastrophe if I was confined just to New York to hire our team at the time. I was able to get so many amazing resources because I wasn't confined to New York. And when I talked earlier about like a diversity of candidates, you can get so many more people from different backgrounds, different parts of their life cycle, when you don't have to pick a specific location to get them from. We had folks who were in the Midwest. We had folks who were upstate New York. We had folks who were, all over the place. Some of them had families and they would never have been able to to be in New York. Some of them were like me, and just the commute wasn't a reasonable thing to do on a daily basis. So we had about half of our team in New York, half of them were remote. I think at least at the beginning, almost all of my top performers were my remote people. Remote staff tends to work very hard to overcome the stigma of the fact that people think they're not working very hard. So what you actually found was that you had some of the most, dedicated people, and they were really grinding and working hard, and they were committed to the vision. And I think one of the things we did really well, and I think if you want to do remote, you have to do this, is that our in-office people thought of our remote people as part of their team, which meant we had team meetings, everybody dialed in individually like we're doing right now on a Zoom, except for there might be 5 of them sitting in the New York office doing this, so that people couldn't be like chit-chatting and having someone on the mic not hearing them. And so it was always very like, we are equals, the location doesn't matter. But I think for salespeople, think you can do remote if it's a field salesperson, but you can never do remote if it's an inside salesperson. And I completely disagree. I think maybe you don't want to have your most junior people be remote because it's harder for them to learn the skills. But if someone has had a history of success and they're a good salesperson, I don't know why where they're at matters. And certainly from my experience, both now at Atlassian and Trello, which have decent sized remote sales teams, it doesn't pan out that those teams aren't successful, or, quite frankly, they're more successful half the time, at least that I see. So I have no stats that back that up other than the Trello side, which was my top performers were often remote. But it eliminates a lot of that friction. A lot of comp friction is cost of living, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of where you're like, I need X amount and I need to overachieve at X amount because I'm living in New York, I'm living in London, I'm living in Boston, I'm living in San Francisco, and I am in like a tiny room, and I don't want to be in a tiny room with 4 roommates anymore, so I need more money. I think when you pay people appropriately and you let them pick the place they're living, you eliminate that, and all of a sudden there aren't a lot of conversations around comp, and there aren't a lot of conversations around these things because people have a life balance with work and they're happier. And what do happy people do? They work harder and they do better. And so, I'll get off my pulpit, but I think remote is 100% the future, and people are going to need to start embracing it more and more.
So Sam, you should carry on. Go for it. What are some of the, let's explore the disadvantages as well. There's a lot of talk about remote. The problem is, building quickly a culture, or the communication or the excitement that some people need when they're in person. Communication of the vision needs to extra communicate, need to understand, are people available or not when they're on different time zones. What are some of the challenges that you think really hurt it? Really hurts. It's English.
Yeah, I gotcha.
What else? Thank you. What are some of the challenges that you think really hurt the growth of the sales team because of the remote aspect?
Yeah, so we had some core fundamental things, right? You had to work the majority of your day, like 5 hours of your day had to overlap with New York. So we have somebody, if you wanted to hire somebody in Amsterdam, for example, that's fine, but they were going to be working some funky hours to be on time with the team. And so, it ended up most of our team was in the States. The furthest out was West Coast, and it's fine. They would just get up a little early. So we had guardrails around it, right? But I would say that, the biggest challenge, maybe, I don't know if it hurt the team or not, but it was something that had to have a lot of effort put towards it that maybe you could eliminate if everyone was in the office, was that concept of building the culture and thinking, well, if we do a fun thing, if we celebrate a good month being achieved, how do we make sure that if we're bringing in donuts for New York, or we're going to take them out for lunch, which we would do things like that, how do you make sure that the remote people are part of that? And so I don't know if it was as much on the sales team as it was on like myself and later my managers, of thinking like, okay, you can't just say, let's all ring a bell in the office and cheer, because that eliminates a bunch of people. So we would ring the bell in Slack, right? We would have an action for sales wins, and that would be where everyone in the company could see it, not just the sales team. We did celebrations, if it was like birthdays or something. If you were remote, you got sent a cake too. So we tried to think about things like that. But I would definitely say, like, it took up a not 0% of our time, right? Thinking about how do you keep the remote people connected. You take some cost in things like having on-sites a little more often than maybe you would have, like having everyone fly in for a QBR, or so that they could get together and they could all go out to dinner and we could all go do something silly together, bowling or whatever. So they had those times to bond. So yeah, you pay maybe a little bit in the travel cost and in some time. But I wouldn't say it hurt us, but I would definitely say like it was a component that we had to think about that maybe if you don't have that remote side, you don't have to do.
Okay. So let's move to the more positive side. What are some of the main advantage that you had? You already said about the compensation, less of a problem if you're not living in a very expensive country or city in this case. What are some of the other big advantages that you see?
I mean, for the business, I think, if you want to take out all the people component of it, we didn't have to expand our real estate in New York, which was really expensive real estate, right? So, and you think about companies in San Francisco and stuff like that. So every time I added a person, it didn't mean a desk had to be filled necessarily in New York, which allowed us to keep our real estate costs pretty low. I mentioned it before, but you get a diversity of candidates, I think, that you oftentimes don't get. A diversity of experience that you oftentimes don't get when you're trying to hire in an area. One of the other big things is that the churn, like normally when you have a sales team, there's X amount of churn, you can't avoid that. But oftentimes there's churn because, hey, my spouse or my significant other or whatever got a job somewhere else and I'm going with them, right? Like I had someone whose spouse got into medical school and they had to go do their residency in another state, super common. Or, even things like, hey, my parents are elderly and like I need to move closer to home to take care of them. Those would be people who you would lose if you weren't open to remote work. That would be a good employee who under normal circumstances you would never have wanted to leave your organization, who you're now going to lose for a reason that they can't sit where you're sitting. And so for us, we had basically no churn for anything along those lines. And to not have any of that was really important when we were growing and we had high performers. And so the loss of those people just would have been so substantial for us. So, there's a million more benefits, but those are some of the big ones.
Makes sense. Do you have to look for something during the interview process to make sure that person is remote able?
I think the best thing oftentimes was understanding if they had done remote before. That's obviously a huge benefit, but I didn't look for anything in particular. I think we were really open with hey, there are challenges that come with remote. You will be lonely. Are you someone who's going to feel lonely? Like there's these things. And we would give them like a stipend if they wanted to go work at a WeWork or something in their local cities and towns. If they were the kind of person who's like, I just like noise around me. It's important. But nothing too in particular, that we looked for from a remote standpoint.
All right, Kristen, we're coming out of time, so I'm going to move quickly to maybe book recommendations. What would you recommend people reading if they want to improve on their sales skills in a SaaS environment?
Yeah, that's a hard one for me. I don't do a lot of sales books necessarily. I do a lot of I like podcasts. I like I like being on LinkedIn and seeing what people who I think of as good sales leaders are recommending, are posting. I think a lot of good content's coming out on LinkedIn anymore, and I think it's a little bit more, it can be a little bit more timely because it doesn't have to go through a large publishing process and all of that. So I don't have anything in particular, unfortunately, to recommend.
That's fine. Do you want to switch to actually who are the sales leaders you're following?
I don't know if it's anybody like recognizable, right? It's more like people who I've worked with that I
see.
Yeah. So, like previous managers or colleagues or whatever that have progressed on, and I like to see what they're promoting.
Okay, so let's switch the table a little bit. Let's say you have a person in your shoes going into a situation like the Trello situation. What would you give them as a quick advice to make sure they succeed?
Yeah, I would say network as much as possible. Like ask people for advice. Reach out to folks that are in similar industries and say, "Hey, I'd like to pick your brain." I find that people are very receptive to that. I've had people do it with me, and I'm always happy to say, "Yeah, let's chat through your model and how was it similar? What would I recommend?" And I just think that people want to share their expertise, but they also want to hear what the challenges are other people are going through too, because it helps them with something that might be coming down the line for them. So it really can be a win-win. So I'm a huge believer in expanding that network, saying yes when people ask you for feedback and advice, but also being willing to reach out and say, I don't know you, but you're the VP of sales or you're the head of sales at a company I admire. Do you have 15 minutes, for me to buy you a cup of coffee, or if you're in the same city, or jump on a Zoom, and I would love to pick your brain. I find a lot of people say yes on that. More people say yes than they say no.
Love it. I can vouch for that, actually.
Yeah.
But that's a great segue, actually. How can people get in touch with you?
Sure. So
or know more about you as well.
Yeah, they can ping me on Twitter. That not that I'm on social media too much, but I will respond to it. They can ping me on LinkedIn, or they can email me at just Kristen at Trello.com. It's the easiest one to reach me. But yeah, any of those ways will work.
So you kept that Trello thing. Is it a nostalgia thing?
Yeah, I still have it. It's my Atlassian email address, but the Atlassian one, you have to spell out my whole last name, and then you have to spell out Atlassian, and it's just, I find the Trello one's easier for people.
It's that real estate advantage of joining early a company, right?
Yes, you get that Kristen instead of Kristen H24 whatever. Yeah, I had that name, and I would not hire any Kristens. It was, really
of course. That's criteria number one for hiring. Well, Kristen, thank you so much for the chat. It was lovely.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.